When we say she has her mother's eyes, we mean that the little girl has inherited certain characteristics from her mother. We say like begets like. How is it that the mother cat has offspring like this? Or this? But this cat will never have offspring like this. How is it that mice like these continue to produce only gray mice for generation after generation? And how can these mice continue breeding only white mice for generations? There must be some mechanisms by which characteristics are transmitted from generation to generation in a consistent way. Perhaps we can learn something about these mechanisms of heredity by observing the results of mating mice from two pure breeding strains that differ in color of fur. We call this a hybrid cross. The first generation of this cross looks like this. Each individual is gray. Does this mean that inheritance is determined only by the gray parent? What happens if two adult individuals of this hybrid generation are mated? The gray color characteristic is somehow dominant. Yet we can see that in this second generation, inheritance from the original white parent is expressed in one individual. The same kind of result occurs whether the original parents were white male and gray female, or gray male and white female. Gray fur color predominates, but white is expressed in the second generation. How does this come about? We will assume that in each parent there are precise specifications that determine the animal's characteristics. We call these specifications genes. Let us consider the genes that determine color of fur. When a gene, such as one for whiteness of fur, has an alternative form, such as one for grayness of fur, the alternative form is called an allele. Now let's assume that the sex cells of the parents each contain one of these genes for color of fur. If the sex cells unite, the resulting cells, or zygotes, each contain a pair of genes for color of fur, one gene for white and one for gray. But we know that all the zygotes of this generation develop into gray mice. It appears that only one of the genes for color is expressed in individuals of this generation, and it is always the gray gene. In this case, we would say that the gene for gray color is dominant over its allele for white color. What happens when mice of this generation are mated? We believe that in each parent, half the genes are for pure gray color of fur, half for pure white. We assume that the genes in each pair separate when sex cells are formed, so that each sex cell contains only one gene for color of fur. Can we also assume that zygotes of the new generation would be formed through a chance combination of a gene from each parent? A simple demonstration will show what to expect. For each gene pair, we will use one gray ball and one white ball. We put the same number of pairs into each container and mix them well. The balls in the containers represent genes that can be transmitted by each parent. What happens when such genes are combined purely through chance? Our random selection from the gray and white genes of each container results in 4 possible combinations of pairs. Approximately 1/4 of the pairs are gray-gray. Approximately 1/4 are gray-white, 1/4 white-gray, and 1/4 white-white. Now, if our ideas hold true, we would expect the progeny of hybrid mice to contain pairs of genes for fur color like this. 1/4 would contain paired gray genes and would be gray. 2/4, with gene pairs consisting of one gray and one white, would be gray, since the gray gene is dominant. 1/4 with white genes paired could only be white. Such genes expressed only when paired with each other, never when paired with a dominant allele, are called recessive genes. Thus we'd expect 3/4 of the mice of this generation to be gray and 1/4 to be white. How do the actual results of such crosses among live mice compare with our predictions? The hybrid mice in our laboratory so far have produced young of which 29 are gray and 11 are white. This is very close to our predicted ratio of 3/4 gray to 1/4 white. The slight discrepancy can be attributed to the smallness of the sample. Do our ideas about heredity apply to other organisms as well as mice? For example, this. We can take garden pea plants, pure breeding for white flowers, and cross them with plants that are pure breeding for red flowers. Each parent has genes for color of flower. If each parent contributes one gene for color of flower to the offspring, each plant of the new generation would have one gene for red color and one for white. The actual results of such a cross show this. Since the gene for red is expressed, we believe that the red gene is dominant over the white one. Can we predict the results of self-fertilization in these hybrid plants? If the same mechanisms of independent segregation and chance combination apply to genes for the color of flowers, we would get gene combinations like this. Since we believe the red gene to be dominant, we would expect the color of flowers in this generation to be 3/4 red and 1/4 white. And this is, in fact, what we get. Approximately 3/4 of the progeny of the hybrids show the dominant trait, red color, and the remaining quarters show the recessive trait, white color. Garden peas can be used to demonstrate the inheritance of many other characteristics. For example, a tall variety can be crossed with a dwarf variety. The resulting hybrids show tallness to be dominant and dwarfness to be recessive. If these hybrids are self-fertilized, we can predict how the dominant and recessive traits will be expressed. So far, we have considered inheritance in plants that differ in only one characteristic. Let us examine a cross between plants that differ in two characteristics, a dihybrid cross. One plant is a variety that is tall with white flowers. The other is dwarf with red flowers. The first generation of this dihybrid cross looks like this. The dominant genes for tallness and for red color are expressed in this generation. Can we predict how these genes will be expressed if the dihybrids are self-fertilized? Let's go back to the original parents and their gene pairs. One has genes for tallness and white color. The other has genes for dwarfness and red color. If their sex cells are combined, the resulting combinations can only be like this. Every plant of the new generation will contain the same complement of these genes. But what happens to the genes if these dihybrids are self-fertilized? If the genes are segregated independently into the sex cells and combined by chance, a variety of combinations is possible. There is a way to determine the probable combinations mathematically. We know that in a simple cross of tall and dwarf plants, 3/4 will be tall and 1/4 will be dwarf. In a simple cross involving red and white flowers, 3/4 will be red and 1/4 will be white. Mathematically, the chances of tallness and redness occurring together can be expressed as the product of their chances of occurring separately. Thus, the chance of a tall red combination is about 9/16. The chance of a tall white combination is 3/16. Dwarf red, 3/16, and dwarf white, 1/16. In an actual dihybrid cross, the progeny do occur in the predicted ratios. Such a controlled cross and careful observation of progeny is called an inheritance test. It was used by Gregor Mendel in his pioneering study of inheritance over a century ago. It is now the basic tool of genetics. If Mendel had used 4 o'clock plants instead of garden peas for an inheritance test, he might have had different results. Clearly, these hybrids are pink, an intermediate color between the red and the white of the parent plants. Does this mean that inherited characteristics are sometimes blended? What happens to the genes if these hybrids are self-fertilized? If each pair of genes in this plant consists of 1 white and 1 red gene, we would expect these gene combinations. 1/4 of the gene pairs would have red genes. 1/4 would have red-white combinations. 1/4 would have white-red, and 1/4 would have white-white. An actual hybrid cross shows that 1/4 of the plants in the new generation bear red flowers, 2/4 bear pink flowers, and 1/4 bear white. The appearance of both red and white flowers demonstrates that genes are not blended. They continue to be transmitted in their original pure state through the sex cells of the parents. The pink color must result from a pair of alleles that are intermediate in expression rather than dominant and recessive. The inheritance test thus confirms our original premises. The units of heredity, genes, exist in alternative forms called alleles. These genes occur in pairs. Genes segregate independently during the formation of sex cells and are recombined in the zygote through chance. A gene pair may have 1 allele that is dominant in expression, but either allele can be transmitted from generation to generation without being changed by the other. When we understand these mechanisms of heredity, we can predict statistically the occurrence of inherited characteristics. Of course, the more differing hereditary characteristics involved in a given cross, the more combinations are possible. When only 10 pairs of genes are involved, for example, the number of possible combinations is in the hundreds of thousands. Every human being, like many other organisms, represents a combination of tens of thousands of gene pairs, 1 gene of each pair being inherited from each parent. That is how like begets like. That is also how, in the different species that inhabit the earth, infinite variety is possible.